This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Good afternoon. I'm Lily Bayer, a reporter at Politico covering NATO here in Brussels. You are watching Politico Live, an extension of Politico's journalism. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has redefined how Brussels thinks about defense. We have seen changes in the EU and NATO, both in terms of policy and priorities, and we can expect many more changes and policy debates over the coming months. We will be discussing this and more with our panelists. But first, some housekeeping. I would like to thank our sponsor, the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies, for making this event possible, and thank our audience for joining us online. We would like to make this event as interactive as possible. You can participate by tweeting at @LivePolitico. You can also ask questions through Slido using the hashtag #PoliticoProtectingEU. In the interest of transparency, I will be prioritizing questions that are sent with a name. You can already share your thoughts and answer the following poll question presented by our partner, the Martin Center. And the question is, has the EU changed its approach to defense enough to deal with the effects of Russia's aggression against Ukraine and threats to EU member states? We will look at the results at the end of our panel. Before we get started, we'll now hear some opening remarks from our partner, Mikuláš Dzurinda, former Prime Minister of Slovakia and now President of the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies.
Thank you, Lily. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I believe it is obvious that the Russian aggression against Ukraine goes beyond a conflict between two states. This is because the Russian attack violates the basic rules and principles of international law. The aggressor must face justice, and the victim must benefit from the solidarity of as much of the international community as possible. It is not clear, unfortunately, how long the war will last. Russia has remained committed to waging war against Ukraine. And Ukraine has ruled out any peace that does not involve the return of all its occupied provinces, including the province of Crimea. Furthermore, Ukrainian lands, which are currently seeking to free themselves from Russian occupation, are perceived by both sides as part of their national identity, although they remain Ukrainian under international law. This means, however, that the chances for a sustainable peace agreement are currently rather slim. Therefore, the EU must be prepared for protracted Russian aggression, which will be characterized by intermittent periods of escalation and de-escalation. Another element with serious consequences is a new, let me say, strategic alliance between Russia and China. We cannot exclude a scenario where China capitalizes on the scenario where the West is preoccupied with Russia to launch an attack on Taiwan or another confrontation against the West. Therefore, to deal with such conflict and potential global development, the EU needs to adopt relevant measures. This concerns both the economic sphere and the area of security and defense. Well, NATO provides the main tool of our European security. But we need more than to rely on NATO or United States all the time. We need to increase our own European military mobility. In other words, we must strengthen the European pillar of NATO and unlock its remaining potential. Only then can NATO provide credible deterrence in Europe. Building and developing our European deterrence is important for the sake of our own European security, but also as an instrument to help Ukraine stop Russian aggression. It is also obvious that in the immediate post-war period, EU member states should provide Ukraine with security assurances to protect the country against any additional Russian acts of aggression. The EU must take further steps to boost the overall competitiveness of the European defense technological base and fill the capability shortfalls that supporting Ukraine has caused in the weapon stockpiles of EU countries. The EU, by my mind, must also move forward with the creation of a genuine common European defense market to reduce existing inefficiencies and increase demand for military capabilities made in Europe, both globally and from Europe itself. There is no doubt Russia's war against Ukraine has had and will continue to have substantial implications in many areas, including European defense. To respond to these challenges, we need brave political leadership and supplementary financial resources. So it is very, very important to raise these issues in public debate to help people understand that our European security cannot be taken for granted, but actually requires a certain sacrifice. I am glad that our discussion today will try to contribute to this issue with new and constructive ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dzurinda. And now I would like to introduce our panel. We have Max Bergman joining us. He is the director of the Europe program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We have Muriel Dominac, ambassador of France to NATO. And we have David Corey, ambassador of the United Kingdom to NATO. Welcome all, and thank you again for joining us. To start, I'd like to do one quick round, just a yes or no question. And I know that usually diplomats and experts hate yes or no questions, but I promise that we'll get into the details right after. So our yes or no question is Europe safer now than it was 13 months ago? And we'll start with you, Ambassador Dominac. Yes or no? Is it safer than 13 months ago?
Already I'm starting answering your question instead of saying yes or no. There's a war in Europe.
That's a very direct answer. Ambassador Corey.
I agree. We're not safer than we were a year ago.
And Mr. Bergman.
I'll disagree. I'll say Europe is safer because they're more aware of the dangers that are existing.
Very interesting. And so we'll jump into the crux of our discussion. It's been over a year of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The fighting is raging. Western allies are providing enormous amounts of support to Ukraine. How has the war in Ukraine changed how Europe is thinking about defense? Ambassador Domenac, how, in your opinion, is thinking about defense evolving? And in particular, do you think that the French government's view of European defense is shifting?
I think our threat perception and the threat perception of our society is it's shifting in the sense that more and more in France are seeing Russia as a threat, and very much like the rest of Europeans, we are definitely done with the peace dividends. This is an age of responsibility. This is an age of awareness that now is the time to defend Europe, support Ukraine, ramp up our military cooperation, speed up our defense effort. So that takes national efforts, takes efforts within the EU, efforts within Europe, efforts within NATO, and our two countries, France and the UK, were always leaders in Europe when it comes to defense, and always encouraged awareness from our fellow European partners. So David and I here at NATO, just like our colleagues in Capital, will be encouraging this awareness that the time is to ramp up our defense efforts.
Very interesting. Ambassador Corey, how do you think the UK's perspective on defense has changed over the past 13 months?
Well, I think 2 years ago, in our integrated review, our big strategic assessment document in 2021, we then sketched out our view of the world that we were entering, a world that was going to see more systemic competition, more strategic rivalry, and a greater risk of instability in our broader security environment. And unfortunately, we've seen that come at us even more quickly and even more strongly than we had feared. So, unfortunately, as we've said in the refresh of that integrated review last week or 2 weeks ago, we are in that world of increased volatility and competition and increased conflict. That requires all of us to increase our defense investment, to boost our capabilities, to support Ukraine, and to boost our cooperation, both within NATO and between NATO and other partners. And as Muriel said, the UK and France, Europe's two leading military powers, we're each increasing our investment. At the Anglo-French summit recently, we agreed how we would deepen cooperation in some critical areas. But we all have work to do in building those capabilities and in sustaining investment, probably for years to come, in the face of that deteriorating global security environment.
Mr. Bergman, how much change do you see in practice when it comes to European defense policy over the past year? And do you think that more change and thinking is needed about how it should evolve in the future?
Well, I think there's been a lot of change, but it is sort of a glass half full, glass half empty question where I think you can argue it both ways. On the one hand, Europe has really acted. We're seeing the European Peace Facility and the EU being used to acquire weaponry or to backfill countries that have sent weapons to Ukraine. NATO, I think, has really been reinvigorated with a real focus on the threat from Russia. There's, I think, a lot of energy ahead of the Vilnius summit, and there's a lot of energy at the Madrid summit. Finland is on the cusp of membership, and potentially Sweden as well. So on the one hand, a lot has changed. On the other hand, there's a lot more change that is needed, in part because, number one, Europe had underinvested in defense for a very long time. Number two, that the focus was not on conventional warfare, but often on operations abroad, which still may come, there or still may be important, but there's a need to now shift focus back to conventional warfare. And I think number three, there needs to be more done, I think, collectively in Europe. The Prime Minister, when he opened, noted discussion of a European pillar of NATO, and I think that is where the direction of European defense energies really need to head, where Europe thinking more collectively about its defense. And that's very challenging because defense remains a national prerogative where NATO tries to coordinate. But I think this is where there needs to be more movement in Europe, really sort of acting and thinking and spending together when it comes to European defense.
Very interesting. We've heard several mentions already of defense investment. This will be a huge issue as we come up to NATO's Vilnius summit scheduled for July. A decade ago, in 2014, NATO leaders pledged to aim to spend 2% of gross domestic product on defense by 2024. The latest NATO report shows that only 7 allies met that target in 2022, and now leaders will have to review that target at the summit. Last week, actually, Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki told Politico that he will be advocating for this target to be raised from 2% of GDP to 3% of GDP. Ambassador Corey, will the United Kingdom be advocating for a new number, a new target, or will you be sticking to the 2% in Vilnius?
Well, it's clear, as I said earlier, that we need increased defence investment and that we need to sustain that increase over time. Since 2014, since the 2% pledge was introduced, non-US allies within NATO have increased their defence spending by around $350 billion US dollars. But we need to go further than that. And I think we all recognise that those increases will be required over time. Nationally, we are above 2% at the moment, and the Prime Minister has set out an aspiration of getting to 2.5% in the coming years. So definitely at Vilnius, we will be supporting the Secretary General and others who have called for 2% to be a floor, not a ceiling. Everybody should be trying to get above 2% and to get there as quickly as possible, really immediately. Now, whether we can get to a higher target or not, I don't know, but we would definitely want to see 2% established as an immediate commitment and as a floor, not a ceiling.
Mr. Bergman, you're in Washington, D.C. right now. I was very curious what you think could be the U.S. position on this. You mentioned that from your perspective, there should be more of a European pillar to NATO. Do you think that this dynamic might impact the U.S. perspective on the spending target?
Well, I think I may not adhere to the standard U.S. position here. I think what the Biden administration will push for is as much national defense spending as possible. Will likely, I think, advocate for a 2.5% or 3% target. To me, I think 2% has been somewhat of a diplomatic disaster in the sense that it has created a real wrecking ball that the United States has oftentimes used to attack the NATO alliance and I think has probably done more diplomatically to undermine the NATO alliance. And I'm very nervous about setting a target that is not going to be achievable. I think it would be great if every country did spend 3%. I completely agree with Ambassador Corey that NATO countries need to spend more. However, I do think that one of the challenges is that it's not that I think the way the United States sees it is more national defense spending will solve all Europe's defense problems. And I do not think that that's the case. I think part of what's needed is more common spending, more collective spending, focusing resources on more targeted efforts. I think what's happening at the EU is a great example of something that should be scaled up in joint procurement of ammunition. That sort of pooling of funding, I think, would really yield much greater benefits to European security overall, because right now, much of European security is dependent on the United States providing many of the enabling capabilities and other assets that the U.S. military has that probably beyond the scope of any one individual European country, and we're seeing efforts to cooperate. But I think that's what we really need to see more of, and then that's spending money more efficiently, and I think that's in everyone's interest.
I know that France has pledged to increase its own defense spending over the past few years. Ambassador Domenac, what is your view about the future of NATO's 2% target?
Correct, Lily. Emmanuel Macron, our president, pledged to spend 413 billion euros for the next national program law, 2024-2030. By 2030, France will have doubled its defense efforts as compared to 2017. The next program law will show an increase by 40% as compared to the previous period of time. And we are currently increasing by 3 billion euros every year our defense spending in tense fiscal situation with, of course, climate change, with the recapitalization of our welfare state, with the education, and all of this having to, all of us having to challenge those priorities at the same time. However, it comes to maybe some surprise that the French, as I read from a recent NATO study actually being issued today, 46% of the French population actually want to spend more on defense, while the NATO average is 35%. So the average of the French people, the proportion of the French people, 46% that want to spend more on defense, is higher than the NATO average. So the awareness that we need to be doing more on defense is there, clearly due to threat perception. As I said earlier, clearly over the last 15 months, it's become clear that war is back in Europe, in addition to the rest of the challenges, terrorism, strategic competition, as mentioned by David. So yes, we need to do more. We need to spend more. Our view in France is not that cash is enough, or that cash would sort of square the circle. We would rather praise 2% utile, as we say in French, 2% that actually deliver. It's not numbers that will impress any strategic competitors. It's the actual ability to deploy capabilities, ships at sea, project forces on the ground. France currently is conducting a major exercise called Orion, multi-domain exercise. We will be deploying a division. We are the few countries that are able to project a division and add air elements and of course ships. This is what we understand by 2% that deliver, 2% utile. Now it's clear that we won't be able to deliver unless enough cash is put on defense. So strong support to defense efforts. And at the same time, we need the defense effort to actually deliver. And I stand ready to further questions on how to deliver better.
It's very interesting, Ambassador, that you mentioned public opinion and the percentage of support for defense investment, because one thing that I'm sure is on the minds of many officials across both the European continent and the broader NATO alliance is public opinion and public support for Ukraine, which is currently quite high in most countries. But there are officials who fear a sort of war fatigue, or at least that a war fatigue could set in. So, Mr. Bergman, because I know that this is an issue that has come up in the U.S. in particular, in discussions regarding the Republican primary race, is it your sense that officials and experts are confident that public opinion will stay behind Ukraine and will stay behind the current high levels of support in terms of weapons, financing, ammunition? Or do you think that there's real cause for concern that the public may get a bit wary?
So I think there's very strong public support, but that doesn't mean that there isn't cause for concern. Because the shift in power that happened in November, where the Republicans took over the lower house, the House of House of Representatives, it doesn't bode well for significant additional funding for Ukraine. And the reason why is that Kevin McCarthy, the new Speaker of the House, has a very narrow majority, and while there's probably 80 to 90% support within the Republican Party, within his caucus, in support of providing funding for Ukraine, he's not going to want to bring forth any appropriations or spending bills that would potentially divide his caucus. That means I think it's going to be very difficult for the United States to be doing what it has done over the last year, which is allocating a lot of money to backfill the Pentagon, which is then giving away equipment to Ukraine. And so essentially the Congress has been acting very similarly to the European Peace Facility. And what's going to happen is that money, I think, will dry up. That doesn't mean our funding and support for Ukraine will stop, but it will mean that it will become harder, that the United States will have to reallocate money inside of its very massive Pentagon budget. It can find tens of billions of dollars in the couch cushions. Our defense spending is over $800 billion. But that becomes more bureaucratically tricky. It requires moving money around. It requires some more clever accounting, and things can maybe slow down. And I think there will be a need to support Ukraine. The support for Ukraine will continue. Or the need to support for Ukraine will continue. And I think Europe may have to bear more of the burden, even though Europe has done quite a lot. I think it is really important that we get production lines going of tanks and other weapon systems that could be redirected to Ukraine. So I think using the European Peace Facility as has been directed is a good first step. Other countries putting in orders, the UK and others, that I think is going to be really important, because Ukraine will need to replace the tanks that are currently, being prepared to be sent into battle. We have to think about what will happen in 2024. How will it recapitalize the military equipment that will be lost over the next year?
Ambassador Dominak, do you think that the current levels of support for Ukraine are sustainable if the war continues for months or even years into the future?
The current level of support in France to military support to Ukraine is high and remains high. It's 66% of the French population that support military support to Ukraine, and we see little change over time. I think this has to do with threat perception. Again, it had to do also with the reporting of mass crimes perpetrated by Russia. I recently exposed the aggression of Ukraine as a rape, quoting President Putin in a number of his interventions. I was surprised by the number of support, the amount of support I got on the social media. And at the same time, convergence in insult from a variety of audience. I won't dwell on that. But to my surprise, I have to say there's more and more despite the threat perception in France that basically the primary threat the man or woman in the street would face has been terrorism, of course, but there's a growing sense and stable sense of perception that Russia is actually a threat. Now, if we want to be able to sustain both our defense efforts and support to Ukraine, and I would follow Max on that, we need more European cooperation. And I have to be very blunt on that. If the US administration wants Europeans to do more, and if the US administration wants the Europeans to be less dependent on the US military in general, it has to encourage us to have our industry at the forefront of cooperation and support to Ukraine. We won't be less dependent and more responsible if we are more dependent on US industry. Plus, obviously, if we want to sustain our efforts, it has to benefit our society. I mean, if you take France, our defense industry involves 200,000 jobs. I think it speaks for itself. So yes, the level of support is high and stable, connected to the threat perception. But if we want to sustain this defense effort and do more in terms of burden sharing, it has to benefit our societies.
Ambassador Corey, are you concerned at all about the sustainability of aid to Ukraine? The UK is, of course, a huge provider of support, military weapons and training. Do you think that you can sustain both the production side of things, but also the political support in terms of public opinion that is needed to support Ukraine?
Well, I'm not concerned about the level of public or political support. There is very strong bipartisan support in Parliament for what we are doing to support Ukraine, both politically, militarily, in terms of economic support. There's very strong popular support for Ukraine. And I think that's partly because of the moral clarity of the case that Muriel mentioned. You've got a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council that's invaded another member of the United Nations, which is exercising its right to defend itself and trying to secure its own freedom. So I think the moral case is very clear. In terms of the broader agenda, I think both Max and Muriel have touched on a very important point about our defence industrial base. And I think this is really going to be one of the key issues for the Vilnius summit now, because it is very clear that all of our extraordinary support to Ukraine and all the work that we are doing sort of nationally is putting quite a severe test, is posing quite a severe test for our defence industrial bases. So we have got a lot of work to do, both short term in terms of maintaining the supply to Ukraine and making sure that they get the equipment, the capabilities they need to be able to win on the battlefield now, but also that we are putting in place the measures to give us a much sounder defence industrial base for years and decades to come. Again, this will be an area where we will need a sustained increase in government investment, but we also need to go beyond that. We need a much clearer demand signal to industry. We need much clearer standards. We need to get back to having much more interchangeability as well as interoperability in terms of what we do within NATO. And we need to break down barriers between allies in terms of our defence industrial cooperation. So I think all of those are going to be very big themes for Vilnius, because they will be critical to underpinning all the work that we want to do and that we will need to do to support Ukraine for years to come.
The European Union is working on multiple initiatives to try to spur that investment in Europe's defense industrial base. Going back to you, Mr. Bergman, I was curious whether you think that there are any steps specifically that the EU should take that they haven't yet in order to better invest in production and in manufacturing to ensure that both European allies have sufficient weapons and equipment in store, but that they can also continue to support Ukraine.
Well, yes. I mean, I think that the pilot program goes by that acronym DERPA, which is to begin joint investments, is a really important initiative. I just think there isn't enough funding, and I think one of the disappointments, I think, in response to this crisis is that we saw the European Union do joint borrowing in response to COVID, with the Next Gen EU fund being established of roughly 800 billion euros. If the EU had done something similar at 100 billion euros, I think we would potentially be in a very different place. I think just on the defense industrial side, though, I think that this is now a recognized problem for the transatlantic alliance, for the NATO alliance, that the European defense industrial base isn't up to par. We're actually in the United States finding that our defense industrial base, when it comes to high-end warfare, is also there's some things that we need to work out. But one of the things that I think needs to happen, and I completely agree with Ambassador Dominic and Ambassador Corey, that the United States also needs to look at its policies toward Europe. And the former prime minister, when he opened up the remarks, mentioned a common European defense market. And right now, I think either we need to think about either integrating our defense markets much more closely, which means sort of building off of what we've seen with AUKUS, which is that the United States, Australia, and the UK are doing a lot more technology sharing. We're trying to get past a lot of our technology restrictions of that we put in place. The so-called ITAR is a real issue in how the United States companies can cooperate with European companies. So we either need to work toward integrating our companies and integrating our defense markets. I think that actually will be much more challenging than actually just building and accepting a common European defense market. And I think Ambassador Dominic is right that part of the way we sustain our defense spending in the United States, it's also a jobs program, that members of Congress know that if they invest in defense, that money is being put back into the economy. And that isn't the case in Europe, and you see less political support. So that's something I think we really need to reckon with, and it's going to require, I think, changes in approach on both sides of the Atlantic.
Ambassador Dominak, how do you see the EU at the moment? Because we've seen basically European Union institutions going into areas that traditionally they weren't quite associated with. I think your government has been pretty supportive of that. But do you think there's room for the EU to do more? Is there anything else that you want to see the European Commission, for example, doing on defense? We can't hear you, Ambassador.
Sorry. There's definitely room for the EU to do more. That it was the Estonian Prime Minister Kallas, that initiated the most recent decisions on ammunition. The European Union decided in the context of the last European Council to dedicate 1 billion euros to the delivery to Ukraine of existing ammunition stocks, and 1 billion euros plus 1 billion co-financed by member states in joint procurement on ammunition, plus another ramp up of the industry. So that plan had been initiated by, not by France. France is often seen as, especially when it comes to European defense and industrial cooperation, as always the initiator, but that it came from the Estonian Prime Minister speaks for the need for further further progress. Now, Commissioner is currently touring sites. He was in Poland yesterday, and again that his recent visits to Central and Eastern European countries were so productive speaks for itself. We need to do more if we are to be able to sustain both politically, but also even more importantly, industrially speaking, our support to Ukraine. There's bottlenecks, there's powder procurement issues, there's production capabilities issues. All of that can be usefully tackled through EU support, Commission support. So let me sum it up. There's the European Defence Fund track support to, I would say, advanced capabilities. There's EDIRPA that Max mentioned. The European Defence Fund is 8 billion. There's EDIRPA incentive to joint procurement. It's 530 million euros. And three, the most recent initiatives, there's support to the industry with 2 billion from the Commission, an additional 1 billion from member states, and then more money will come from the Commission in that case, and this is interesting, not based on defense provisions, but rather on Article 173 of the EU Treaty that provides for the development of a European industrial basis in general, not necessarily defense bases. And of course, all countries that participate in the EU single market can access the mechanism. So this is the right way to go. Of course, our industry, like the rest of the industries in Europe, have to live up to the current context. Of course, they claim, and I'm sure David would agree with me on that, that they need a demand signal, they need contracts, they need, but our point here at NATO, nationally and also at the EU, is clear from the strategic context that there is a need for more defense industrial production. Governments, the EU, also at NATO, were prepared to add to these demand signals. But we need them to live up to the current strategic context and turn to what we call in French an économie de guerre, war economy, meaning reducing production timelines and accelerating production timelines and reducing costs. And we're prepared as government to support them, but we need them to step up. So that will be part of the conversation at the Vilnius Summit, just like we've initiated with a number of measures, the conversation at the EU level.
Ambassador Corey, do you see opportunities for cooperation between NATO and the EU on this key issue of the defense industrial base, or even any room for initiatives involving specifically the UK and the EU on this matter?
Yeah, I mean, we're all going to need to do more nationally. We're definitely all going to need to do more in partnerships together. And I think actually the EU and NATO have got a strong story in terms of what the two organizations have done together to respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, whether that's the work that we've done on sanctions, on political messaging, on rallying extraordinary financial support to Ukraine. And there'll need to be cooperation in other areas as well. And yeah, we nationally welcome the development of a stronger European pillar for NATO. Now, it's got to be done respecting NATO's paramount role in Euro-Atlantic security. It's got to be done in a way which does not put up barriers to cooperation between allies and in ways which are complementary to what NATO is doing rather than cutting across. But the main point is that we are all going to need to do more. And look at what we're doing nationally. As Max mentioned, we've got AUKUS with Australia and the US. We've got our global combat air program with Italy and Japan. At the UK-France summit recently, we talked about work together to develop deep precision strike capabilities and other missile capabilities. So yeah, there's an awful lot to be getting on with here. Most of it will require partnerships of some kind, and we support and we welcome that. We must use it as an opportunity to break down the barriers for international cooperation, allied cooperation on defence industrial, and make sure that we don't deliberately or inadvertently put up any barriers during that process.
Thank you. Now I'll start taking a couple of questions from the audience. As a reminder, you can send in your questions via Slido. So we have a question here. And to our panelists, if you want to take the question, just wave to me. We have a question here from Roger Hilton from GlobeSec. And he is asking, is NATO investing enough in guarding critical infrastructure from kinetic and non-kinetic threats? Is defending hard and soft security targets with equal vigor feasible on tight budgets? Is there anyone on the panel who'd want to tackle the critical infrastructure question? Ambassador.
Do you want me to go? Sorry.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, look, there's definitely more that we can be doing at NATO. Resilience is primarily a national responsibility for all of our governments, but there is definitely more that we can be doing within the alliance to share best practice on protecting our critical national infrastructure, understanding the kinds of threats and challenges to our CNI and how those will be evolving over time, looking at what the global picture is in terms of the evolution of those threats. And I think there is work underway at the moment to look at critical undersea infrastructure, for example, and what value NATO can add to our national efforts to protect critical undersea infrastructure. So again, this will be something where NATO has a certain role to play. We think it's probably got a growing role to play in supporting our national resilience efforts, but that will be alongside national efforts and other international efforts as well.
Thank you. We also had multiple questions about the dynamics within the alliance, specifically about whether you feel that there is a growing influence of the voices of some of NATO's eastern members, the eastern flank, especially on questions concerning Ukraine. If someone would want to tackle that, maybe Mr. Bergman.
Sure. But I also sort of defer to the people inside the building and NATO, but I think there's no doubt that Eastern members that have been warning about the threat and challenge from Russia have it's clear they had a point, and because of that, I think, and because of the broader awakening in Europe of the potential threat caused by the Russian Federation, that there is now, I think, much more attention paid to the security concerns of Eastern members. And so I think there has been a bit of, yes, there is more clout. However, there is also the economic weight of the major NATO members, such as Germany, such as France, and others. And so I think sometimes we can overstate how much the balance has shifted. So I think, and also there are real concerns to European security that come from North Africa, from the Mediterranean. And so I think the balance has shifted, but I think there is still, I think we can sometimes overstate where the balance of power has gone.
Very interesting. We have another question here from someone in the audience. Hiroshi Taro is asking under what conditions the EU and NATO would accept a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. Would anyone like to tackle that one? A peace agreement, Ambassador? Or maybe Ambassador Domenac first.
Yeah, please. Sorry.
No,
yes,
I'm sure I would echo David on that. We would, of course, welcome any peace agreement in Ukraine. We've been calling Russia to cease its aggression since it started. We've been calling Russia to withdraw from occupied territories. We've been calling Russia to come to the negotiating table with the acknowledgement that Ukraine is a sovereign country, free to choose its future, and that European security principles were agreed in the early 90s, not against Russia, but with Russia. So we would welcome, of course, peace that would take the end of the Russian aggression. Peace is expected by all, starting with the Ukrainians, and while the aggression is continuing, the best leverage for us to contribute to peace is to support the Ukrainians until conditions are met and Russians are prepared to come to the table with the understanding that they would be talking to an independent, sovereign Ukraine, and it's not for us to agree or not agree. Our responsibilities and our interests as European state is to allow the conditions for such discussions to happen.
And Ambassador Corey, you wanted to also weigh in?
No, it's essentially that point. The point is what is acceptable to Ukraine, not to NATO in the EU. And our role, as Muriel has suggested, is to give Ukraine the support that it needs so that it can get itself in the strongest possible position for whenever those negotiations come.
And a final question from me would be on an issue that I have been covering in my own articles, and I know that a lot of officials have been debating in this town as well, which is that Ukraine has been asking for security guarantees from its Western partners. And this is a very thorny issue and has fueled a lot of discussion and I think a lot of different views. There is a proposal out there from Mr. Yermak and also the former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen for a Kiev security compact. We've also heard the British Prime Minister last month talking about possible security assurances and a charter for Ukraine in the Vilnius summit. So I was very curious, perhaps as the last word on this panel, what our panelists think about the prospects for security guarantees. And perhaps we'll start with Ambassador Corey, because your Prime Minister mentioned the issue recently.
Yeah, not surprisingly, I'll agree with him on that point. And yeah, we stand by NATO's decision in 2008. And yeah, we look forward to the day when Ukraine can become a full member of the NATO alliance. In the meantime, it is really important that we both provide the short-term practical military support to help Ukraine defend itself, but also that we build its longer-term capabilities, its longer-term interoperability with NATO, that we help it get to NATO standards, because that is going to be the best way of giving it assurance that it can defend itself while we work towards the prospect of full membership. So we've got both a short-term task in terms of increasing and sustaining our military assistance in the current conflict, but also helping build that longer-term assurance as we work toward eventual membership.
Mr. Bergman, I was curious what your perspective is as an expert.
Well, I think practically speaking, it's going to be very difficult to have a security compact with Ukraine or have Ukraine be a NATO member as long as it's in an active state of war with Russia. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think it was a lie that Russia had to invade Ukraine because of NATO expansion, that Russia had already had a de facto veto over NATO expansion since 2014 because it occupied Ukrainian territory. And so I think there's the main objective for Russia in this war is essentially for the war not to end, to maintain a forever war. So I think if Ukraine is able to be successful in this war, which is why we should be supporting it, and it's able to evict Russia from its territory, get territorial borders that Ukraine can accept, then I think there would no doubt be a real need for not just a security compact, but I would say eventual NATO membership. But I think winning the war is crucial because the security compact, when Ukraine is already in an active state of war, would, by extension, essentially mean a potential war with NATO or war with NATO members. And I think that's what the NATO alliance has been actively avoiding. And that's what, frankly, the United States has been very conscious of avoiding.
And Ambassador Dominak, you get the very last word on the panel. What is your view on the possibility of giving Ukraine security guarantees? We can't hear you.
Sorry, I would agree with both David and Max, and be sure that this will be at the core of our discussions in Vilnius. Ukraine will become an EU member. Ukraine is progressing on its path to NATO membership. We no doubt will reaffirm the perspective. Now, what's at stake for the moment, while the war is raging, is support to Ukraine, and for us to be in a position to accelerate our support to Ukraine, hence the defense and industry cooperation initiatives we discussed earlier. Now, on the long term, and we will have heard this from the French many times, it is also important to remain clear-sighted about the fact that Russia will remain geographically in our immediate neighborhood. This is a parameter that we must take into account without any complacency if we want to create the conditions for a lasting return to stability on the European continent. So there's different horizons. The most urgent one being to support Ukraine so it can counter any counteroffensive from Russia.
And with that, I'd like to say thank you to all of our panelists for a fascinating discussion. I wish we had more time. I think that this has given us some good food for thought for future discussions. We will just take a quick look at the results of the poll presented by our partner, the Wilfred Martens Center for European Studies. So I see here that 66% said not yet, but it will manage to make more progress. And as a reminder, the question was, has the EU changed its approach to defense enough to deal with the effects of Russia's aggression against Ukraine and threats to EU member states? So 66% said not yet, 20% said no, and it is unlikely to do more. 9% said yes, it has made the changes needed. Very interesting. interesting. Finally, thank you to our speakers for joining us. Thank you, the audience, for joining us online. And finally, thank you to our partner, the Wilfred Martens Center for European Studies, for making this event possible. We'd love to hear your feedback, so feel free to email us about the event at live@politico.eu. And finally, you can check our Politico events website for the latest lineup on all of our events happening this year, just www.politico.eu/events. Thanks again for joining us.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.